You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and I'm delighted today to be joined by my friend Reid Zeller, who is going to share a story. Reid, it's good to see you.
Good to see you too, man.
Let's start, before we get into your story, let's just start a little bit about, like, for you, how did you get interested in story work? Like, what prompted you to begin to engage your story?
Yeah, I think that really began back in 2007. Um, I actually found myself in Fort Collins, where you currently reside, at a ministry conference that Dan Allender happened to be speaking at as a guest speaker. And he was coming to speak to our staff of ministry people about the cost of pursuing stories, um, and inviting us to consider what that looks like as a ministry to pursue the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus and other people's stories. And it really got a hook in me. And I'll never forget his teaching around the Father coming to Adam and Eve, asking them, "Where are you? What is true of your heart?" Here's an all-knowing, all-seeing God asking them,
Mm-hmm.
"Where are you?" And then later on in Genesis, coming to Hagar and asking her, "Where are you from and where are you going?" Essentially asking her, "What are the desires of your heart?" And that really got its hooks in me as I was living as a professional Christian, inviting people to consider what it meant to follow Jesus. And so much of our context was inviting people to think about actually leaving their lives to follow Jesus instead of being curious about where he was already present in their lives as image bearers of God. And so I got intrigued, and it shaped how I ended up talking to people about Jesus on campus, whether that was people who didn't know him yet or the guys who I was pouring into, what it looked like to find him in their stories. And that was all good and well. The hooks got in me until about 6 years later, when my story got flipped upside down through the loss of a child. My wife and I had 3 kids at the time, and we were awaiting our fourth when 2 weeks before his due date, his heart stopped beating. And my whole life got flipped on its head in that year of walking through loss and grief. And there were parts of my heart that felt really difficult to explore and understand. And I spent that year walking with my wife, who was, she was blogging about the agony of her heart and how hard it was for her to get out of bed, or her confusion, or even her rage. And when people would tend to my heart and ask me about how I was doing in my story, I didn't have much language for it. It was almost like, the wheel of emotions. There's that inner circle that are the very broad categories. That's what I had access to. I'm sad. I'm just sad. That's all I've got.
Right.
And it was through the kind, patient pursuit of a therapist that we ended up meeting with that started to beckon my heart to come alive and to actually hurt in ways I didn't know I was allowed to. And so it was through even the pursuit of my own story that there became a growing desire to pursue other people's stories in even deeper ways.
So when you lost your child, that sent you into places in your heart that you had not previously spent much time with. Is that right?
Correct. Absolutely. Yes.
And what was that initial, like, as that started for you, what was that like for you in the beginning?
It was perplexing because here I am. I know that I'm in agony. I know that I'm hurting, but I don't have language. And I see my wife's capacity to describe all the places her heart is being moved to. And I see some people in my life inviting me to some initial steps to explore, but them not really being equipped to ask me the second, third, fourth question, and feeling pretty helpless and powerless to know how to make sense of the deep feelings that are actually in my heart that don't
Right.
feel totally safe to explore.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that is incredibly common for people as something happens in their lives and they start to become aware of big feelings inside, and they either don't have language or they don't have people to turn to process what's going on for them. And so there's a loneliness in that.
Yes, profoundly lonely. Yes.
So how did you navigate that first year, 2, 3 of getting to know your heart?
I wouldn't say I did it very well, honestly. Um, I spent a lot of time tending to my wife's heart,
Uh-huh.
because she was inviting me to
Right.
very proactively. And so um, I was actually quite familiar with setting my own heart aside for the sake of tending to other people's hearts. I was pretty good at that already. And so, in some ways, I slid right into that familiar
Mhm.
experience. But it was, like I said, through her, through the kind invitation of a therapist, that I started to feel that invitation in my heart come alive.
Mhm.
And come alive didn't feel good.
Mhm.
It felt like beckoning sorrow to
Mhm.
come to life. It felt like aching. I cried in ways I had never cried before. I started to
Mhm.
believe that I could yell
Mhm.
in my car out of my anger and agony, and there were slow movements towards um, an authentic experience.
Mhm. So you became familiar with sorrow, with grief, and with anger, rage.
Yes, yes. I started to become. I'd
Yeah.
say I'm still in process of that,
Yeah.
feeling really free to flow.
Okay. So as this is happening, you're meeting with this therapist, you're getting to know your heart, you're feeling feelings, you're expressing feelings. You're not only tending to others, but you're like spending a little bit of time reflecting on your own body, your own heart, your own story. What were some of the obstacles that like got in the way of that process evolving for you?
Yeah, I think some of it was I began to explore why is my heart such unfamiliar terrain? Why is this so difficult for me?
Right.
And I think some of my own childhood, growing up experiences started to come to the surface of why it felt unfamiliar. My family, I would say, uh, is not very adept in pursuing the terrain of the heart.
Mhm.
And I think some of that, felt like if I'm going to do that, if I'm going to return to my own story, am I crossing some lines that are forbidden? I
Okay.
think some of that is from our just kind of broader evangelical experience, right? Like if we're called to live into forgiveness, are we
Mhm.
allowed to return to impact of harm? And
Mhm.
for me, I thought that I would be breaking some rules by returning to impact in ways I had been previously hurt. Was
Mhm.
I living in sin if I returned to old stories by living in unforgiveness? And um, I found that that's not true. I started
Mhm.
to challenge some of those ideologies of forgiveness, that there actually is great honor and more forgiveness to be found by returning to stories.
So there was like a gut check inside about uh don't go there when it comes to looking at some of your growing up experiences. Like that's just terrain that's best not explored.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
How did you I don't know if the word is overcome. How did that shift for you? Because you obviously broke that rule.
Yes, I did. Again, I mean, I think it goes back to what I was naming before. I'm so grateful for the ways I saw my
Mhm.
wife leading out in authentic, raw
Mhm.
honesty. And I saw others actually come up
Mhm.
against that and say, hey, be careful. You're being
Yeah.
too honest. Don't let your anger flow
Yeah.
so freely, sending warnings her way and
Yes.
our way. And I saw her refuse to bow
Yeah.
down to that and to say, I don't
Yeah.
have a choice if I'm going to live. And there was just an invitation for me to follow her and walk with her in her pain that felt like an invitation to
Mhm.
me too. That if I'm going to choose life and believe that there's reason for hope, I'm going to have to engage the death that's been present in my own
Yes.
heart.
Wow. Okay. Well, with that as kind of introduction, you have courageously volunteered to read one of these stories that happened to you in high school, and I would wonder if now would be an okay time to do it.
Fantastic. We are missionaries. The phrase had been proclaimed over us our whole lives, a collective calling of sorts. Yes, I had prayed the prayer at 4 years old, repeating my mother's words to ask Jesus into my heart. But I didn't have the slightest understanding of what it meant to be a missionary or truly follow Jesus as a young boy. But this would be the explanation given for every consequence of my parents' choice to be inner city missionaries. The drive by shootings in our barrio neighborhood, cockroaches that would scurry across the floor, or my longing for Nike basketball shoes that we could never afford. We are missionaries. It wasn't just that my parents had joined a mission organization, taken a vow of poverty, and committed to bring the gospel to the inner city, but my siblings and I were drafted into the family business as well. Even though I went to high school on a wealthy island 20 minutes away from my home in the barrio, I was encouraged to be a missionary there too, to set a godly example and to look for ways to invite my friends to follow Jesus. So it was to my parents' delight when I wanted to take my friends to Winter Jam, a Christian music festival. I was especially excited to see MXPX play because they were a punk rock band who pushed the limits of the Christian scene with their edgy music, and my lost friends actually liked their music too. One additional benefit of driving four friends was that instead of taking my brother's hand me down clunker, I got to drive the old Mercedes Benz that my grandma had recently passed on to my dad. It was a classic car that was ironically far nicer than any car my wealthy friends were driving at the time. As the concert drew to a close, I had a suspicion that the inevitable bait and switch gospel presentation would be on the agenda, so I voted for leaving the concert early. Maybe I was being influenced by the rebellious music, or maybe I was wanting to convince my friends that I wasn't a straight laced, goody goody Christian boy. But I found myself suggesting to the group, hey, here's a crazy idea. What if we drive around and throw eggs at cars? I could tell by the looks on their faces that I had surprised them, and a few of them had reservations since they were actually pretty good kids. But my friends finally agreed to give vandalism a go, and we headed back to the island town to buy supplies and dust up some trouble. Anticipation was high as I slowly drove down the darkened street, and my buddies hung out the windows, gleefully pelting every car we drove by. Eventually, I asked one of my friends if he could drive, and I eagerly grabbed my own carton of eggs. I had just felt the thrill of my first egg connecting with a darkened car when suddenly the car's headlights flashed on. Someone had been sitting inside the car, and they swerved out behind us and chased us down the sleepy streets of the town. Go, 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 we screamed as my friend pushed my grandma's Mercedes beyond what I felt comfortable with. At one point, our pursuer pulled up next to us and took a swing at the car with a metal object that left a big dent on the trunk. We made a quick turn, hit the gas, and drove like our lives depended on it. A block later, a car pulled up close behind us with bright lights blaring in our eyes. My friend, once again, put the pedal to the floor and blew straight through a stop sign. Suddenly, lights started flashing from the top of the car, and a siren blared, letting us know that this night had just taken a turn for the worse. It didn't take long for the police officer to see through our innocent version of the story, with the incriminating evidence of 4 dozen eggs sitting in the back seat. He wrote my friend a ticket for reckless driving and stood beside each of us as we called our parents to come down and pick us up. Since I lived 20 minutes away, I convinced the officer to let me drive home instead of having my parents come to the scene of the crime. I pulled up to our house and sat in the dented car, utterly terrified, knowing that whatever was waiting for me inside was going to be far worse than anything I had already experienced. I walked through the front door and saw my father sitting in his high backed reading chair, and my mom on the couch across from him. My mom looked exhausted, as they had been awoken from a deep sleep, but my father glared at me, fully awake and ready to interrogate. What were you thinking? This was a familiar question in our home, and always required my siblings and me to try to explain our actions. But there was never an acceptable answer that could justify ungodly and stupid behavior. With my head hung low, I muttered, I'm sorry. We were just trying to have fun, but it was a stupid decision. The inquiry continued in rapid succession. Whose idea was this? Where did you get this idea? Why would you ever think this was a good idea? The questions were directed with such speed that I knew the intent was not meant to explore or understand. At last, the gavel sounded and judgment was handed down. You're grounded for a month. You were supposed to be a good influence on your friends, but our fears, instead of our fears that they might be a bad influence on you, you are a bad influence on them. We're so disappointed in you, Reid. Dejected and ashamed, I headed to my room, feeling like the world's worst missionary.
Mm. Thank you, Reid. What's it like to read? I know you've read it before, but what's it like today to read?
There's just deep sadness for him, for that 16-year-old boy, and what he's carrying as the
Mhm.
story ends.
Is it okay if we kind of go back through and just talk about bits and pieces of it?
Absolutely, yeah.
So I've never heard of this band, this punk rock Christian band, MXPX, but I was intrigued that you were really like stoked to see this band play, who pushed the limits with their edgy music. Any sense of, tell me about the boy who's interested in seeing MXPX play?
Yeah. Yeah, there was something that was freeing, that actually kind of like what we were talking about earlier, that there was something about the contours of my heart, that
Hmm.
their lyrics and even the energy of their music was tapping
Yeah.
into. There were parts of my heart that didn't know how to express and find language and be curious about what it's like to be a teenage boy, that they sung
Hmm.
freely about, whether it was romantic feelings or frustrations about power and control, like all these themes that I think when we think about rock and roll we know well, that like so many other people just tapped into my heart and invited some of my heart to come to life.
This 16-year-old is very contained,
Hmm.
but there's stuff in your being that resonates with a band like MXPX.
Yes.
But that stuff that was inside of you as a 16-year-old, it was not often allowed to like come out and like be.
Correct. Yes. Yes.
Any sense of why?
I think there were so many expectations that were placed upon me of what it
Mhm.
means to be good or righteous. And here's these guys who are actually not that much older than me at the time, who are in a band, and they have mohawks and tattoos and lip rings, and they're pressing against all of the definitions of what I have been offered is good.
Right.
And there was something so intriguing about them actually singing about some themes about even Christianity, but doing it in
Yeah.
a way that was just exhilarating to think
Yeah.
about and inviting.
Yeah. So that word expectations is just pulsing for me. Like there are expectations galore on this 16-year-old. But I think, is it fair to say that all of those expectations could be subsumed under the heading of we are missionaries? son.
Yes, absolutely.
What did that phrase, "we are missionaries," mean in your family? What did it mean for this 16-year-old?
It was said with such positivity and joy.
Uh-huh.
You're part of a team. This is
Yep.
who we are. We have decided to move in this direction. It seems like an opportunity to belong. But with that came so much cost and so much, like we're naming, so much expectation. I said earlier, I didn't know at 5 ultimately much about what it meant to follow Jesus when I prayed the prayer. And the reality is at 16, I didn't know all that much more then.
Right.
But I think, like so many other pastors' kids or missionary kids, there is an expectation to take on the role of a professional Christian in ways that your heart is not ready for or has no idea what that looks like. There's still a faith journey that's taking place, and as kids, we're early in that journey for many of us. And so, for me, the idea of we are missionaries is a really tough call. It's a very difficult, and I would even say an impossible invitation for a kid to take
Mhm.
on.
Right. So that's what this 16-year-old is kind of holding at the end of this concert when he has the audacity to voice an idea. And the idea is, let's go egg some cars.
Yes.
Okay. Which, couldn't be further from we are missionaries, right? So, as a 16-year-old that this is defiant to the core. So, do you have any sense of why you suggested, let's go egg some cars, guys?
Yes. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a defiance. I think there's an honest reflection that that behavior is trying to get out. Some of it may be in sync with the music I had just been listening to, that's
Hmm.
trying to really question and wrestle with what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus. But I think another piece of it that feels even larger than a rebelliousness is the story is actually preceded by another story of throwing eggs at cars. Um,
Mm,
Probably about 5 years earlier than this, I had been invited by my older cousins and my older brother to join them on a similar adventure.
got it. Uh-huh.
And being the youngest of these five throughout my whole childhood, I felt like I was always left out or behind. And here
Mm,
was a formative night in my childhood where they invited me to come along and belong
mm,
and to
right.
experience adventure and exhilaration and risk and thrill with them. I couldn't believe
Right.
it. And
Right.
so the idea now of being with my friends in a moment where I could actually create something of meaningful connection through thrill and adventure together
Right.
was awesome. It was like a gift that I could give to them.
The way you've just narrated that with the backstory about being included as a younger kid in this older kid's egg throwing thing, the way you just narrated this 16-year-old night, it's not about egging cars. It's about creating a community environment where people belong and are doing something exciting. Am I hearing you right?
Yes. Yes. It's funny as I think back on it. I think somebody asked me at some point after this experience happened, do you know that eggs can cause permanent damage on cars' paint? And I was shocked. I didn't
Right, of course.
know.
Yeah.
I actually didn't understand that what we were doing was destructive. And
Right.
if I did, I probably could have come up with some better ways to be destructive. I wanted adventure.
Right.
I wanted to experience thrill.
Right. But you didn't merely want adventure, you wanted adventure with others,
Yes, absolutely. Yes,
which says a lot about the 16-year-old's heart to belong and to be part of a group.
yes, absolutely.
So what's it like to name that right now?
Uh, Now, after engaging this story, stepping into it, doing some work with it, and even with you taking in your face as we narrate
Right,
this
right.
together, there's a profound amount of joy and pride I can
Yeah.
actually have for that 16-year-old boy.
Yeah.
I'm stunned, especially given what we just named, that the invitation to belong to a group for me meant I had to abandon myself. I had to
Mhm.
try to take on the mindset of a professional Christian as a
Yeah.
boy. It wasn't an invitation to authentic belonging often. So to be
Right.
able to offer that and help co-create that with my friends, that's stunning, I believe.
Yes. And it's really good to hear you say that. It's really good to hear you say that. So the story continues. It, it goes from bad to worse. There's somebody in the car, one of the cars you egg, they come after you, they dent your car, then the cops are behind you. I mean, looking back, the listeners, I'm sure there's like, some laughter about, well, of course it turned out this way with the cops. But when you pull, there's nothing funny about this as a 16-year-old. You pull up to your house, you're in the dented Mercedes, and what you write is that you're utterly terrified.
Yes.
Do you have a sense of what the terror is for that boy?
Yeah. I knew what was waiting for me when I walked through that door. I knew that there was going to be an interrogation. Um, Before my parents went into ministry, my father was an attorney. And he wasn't a courtroom attorney, he was a tax attorney. But he had the skills of a courtroom attorney. He
Mhm.
practiced those skills on us, with us, in moments like this, where I knew walking through that door, the position that I was going to be asked to take was to sit on a stand and be grilled and have to
Mhm.
testify to what happened, to try to justify and defend what I had experienced.
Mhm. And so what he says is, "What were you thinking?" And you write that this is a familiar question for you. This interrogation about basically your heart, your motives, your reasons for doing whatever you were doing, you and your siblings. But the question, what were you thinking? If it's allowed to be a question, it is actually a lovely question. But it wasn't a question that night. It was an accusation. So when that question slash accusation comes out of his mouth, which you've heard before, what's happening inside the 16-year-old's mind, heart, body?
Just profound indictment and shame. Even though there's like you're naming, there's a question mark at the end of it, it's a
Right.
statement. You weren't thinking. And if you had any thoughts going through your head, they were profoundly foolish.
Mhm.
There was nothing good that went through your mind this night.
Mhm. Right. Right. So you're feeling immense shame and just with the what were you thinking question. But then there are more questions that aren't questions. Whose idea was this? Where did you get this idea? Why would you ever think this was a good? There's more interrogation. Um, and you write a really great sentence in your story where you say that I knew that the intent of my dad's questions was not meant to explore or understand. So if those questions weren't like actual questions, if they weren't meant to explore or understand, what did you feel their intent was?
I think that the intent was to make sure I agreed with the fact that it was a foolish and stupid and ungodly decision in order to
Mhm.
prevent me from ever thinking about doing it again.
Right. The part for me that is the most heart-wrenching in the story is when your dad, in his lawyerly kind of fashion, uh, does that turn of phrase where he says at the end, "We had hoped you would be a good influence on your friends, lead others to Jesus, be a positive influence, but instead, uh, you're a bad influence on them." And then the sentence, "We're so disappointed in you, Reid." W When you think back on those sentences, like, what happened inside that boy?
I think it was such an assault on my sense of worth and value.
Mhm,
Um, your question before, what did it mean to receive the invitation or the statement, we are missionaries, even though it was a requirement to move away from my authentic self in order to belong, I still had some sense of belonging in that. There was a significant part of my identity because it was where I lived and it was where I
mhm.
survived, that it's what I actually clung onto. I was a Without hopefully sounding arrogant, I was a good kid. Um,
Right.
I did really well in school. I had good
Yeah,
friends. I did well in
yeah,
sports. I mean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so to hear in that moment the judgment passed down
right,
ultimately that said, you are not good.
right.
That's what I carried off to my room that night. And it was a threat against what I had come to believe is where my sense of worth and value and belonging comes from.
Mhm.
And
So
ultimately, what it led me to is to double down on that reality. I will be even more good. I will never make this mistake again.
okay, so that's a really helpful, and tragic, but I think very common shift that you just took us into. One of the reasons I ask people to share stories on this podcast is because they're not in the past. They still play out in the present. And what I'm hearing you say is that when you went back to your room that night, something inside of you kind of vowed and committed to be a good missionary, damn it, for the rest of your life.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
How did that go?
In some ways, it went well.
Uh-huh.
It was what I ended up doing. I
Mhm.
went into ministry after college. I think I've had a successful and meaningful career. Trying to be a good missionary.
Uh-huh.
And what I was sharing with you at the beginning of the episode is it actually was unsatisfying because so much of what I was being invited to in being a good missionary was to share Jesus with people in such a way that was calling them to do the very thing I had experienced, to leave my story,
Mm.
accept the fact that they are bad and Jesus is good and they can
Right.
have goodness by taking him on
Right.
instead of finding his goodness in them through the context of their story. And
Mhm.
that caught me at the same time as I started
Mhm.
to share that message that I don't know how much I actually believed that reality for myself, that there was goodness in me as an image bearer, even in stories like the one I'm inviting you into today, that there is profound goodness in me.
Yes. But as you look back now on that 16-year-old, it's not just the excitement to hear MXPX, the boundary pushing punk rock Christian band play. It's seen in its your beauty, your glory, your heart is seen there. But I think far more, there's something in your being that is pushing against the rigidity of the expectations that were unbearable for any boy to live with. And that came out in let's throw some eggs at some cars. So as you look back on that 16-year-old now, how has your posture towards him shifted from the way you felt in your room that night to now, decades later?
It certainly softened. I think for the longest time, when I've thought about younger me, whether it's 16-year-old me or even younger, experiencing these interrogations, I feel so young, fragile, timid. I've had a disdain for his timidity in these
Mm,
moments. Why couldn't I answer the simplest of questions? What were you
mhm,
thinking? That seems like a basic question. But I think as I've continued to grow and sit in these stories and honor the fact of what was happening in my body as those questions were being asked, that I was in survival mode, that part of my brain was going offline as an interrogation was taking
mhm.
place. There's a lot of kindness and compassion for that little boy as I think about his beating heart and not being able to find thoughts in those moments, that he was fighting to survive in those moments. um and now I think there's such a greater sense of compassion for him, that what he was longing for in those moments was to be asked the questions and
Yeah.
to be pursued, to be known, that he was worthy of having the contours of his heart explored.
Yes. Because there were actually, uh, some really good questions if they're allowed to be questions. Like, "What were you thinking?" "Well, I was thinking that there's more to life than the rules. I was thinking that there's something Christ-like about the community that I created with my friends, the adventure, the uh, the initiative, the exploration, all of that we could say arousal that we feel in our adolescent bodies when we're doing something like as a crew, as a group, that is a little bit or a lot bit outside what's appropriate. And there was so much goodness involved. And this is where, our mutual mentor friend Dan Allender, he is fond of saying there is dignity and there is depravity in every single human interaction. And look, I'm not blessing throwing eggs at cars, neither are you. But can there be a naming of the profound dignity in even some of our most horrific moments and behaviors? Because that's what I see in this story. That's what I see in this 16-year-old. It's not a totally depraved 16-year-old. It's a 16-year-old who is doing something wrong, but there's a lot of beautiful goodness in the midst of that process.
Yes. Yes, and I think when you expand into both of those places of dignity and despair, uh, there's so much grace to 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 grow and to move
Mhm,
and to shift. That then the places of despair do not disqualify. They don't
mhm.
take you out. They're not wrong and just bad and consuming of your identity. That there's an honor of the complexity of your heart
Mhm.
and an invitation to continue growing.
The complexity of your heart. I like the way you put that. The complexity, and that's true of us as adolescents, and it's true of us as adults. There is a complexity in each of our hearts. There is a mix of dignity and depravity, glory and sin in all of our interactions. And if we don't look at both, something's going on that's keeping us blind. So, last question before I let you go. How do you think this story shaped you as a 20 something, 30 something? How did this story play out and affect your life?
Yeah. You know, kind of what I was saying earlier is I think there were some vows that were made that
Mhm,
evening that really shaped what you and I have come to call our style of relating. Um, I continued to be um, a fairly timid person at times. I read people very well and what their expectations might be of me, and I adapt.
mm,
When I take the Clifton Strengths Assessment, adaptability is my number one. In some
mhm,
ways, I am a great missionary. I can flow with time changes and food changes and cultural shifts. It doesn't rattle me much because I've learned to adjust well. And
mhm,
unfortunately, there's been a cost to that as well.
mhm,
That when things impact me, I am not as committed to understanding that and vocalizing it and asking
mhm,
for what I need.
mhm,
But I think there's been some growth in that as I continue to put
mhm,
words to that and name that well, that I do have needs. I do have a need to be known to honor the complexity of my heart and to invite people to explore that with me.
mhm, mm. Well, Reid, thank you so much for your willingness, your vulnerability, and sharing this 16-year-old with us today. If people want to get in touch with you, you're a therapist, you've got a private practice. If people want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Yeah. The easiest way to find me is going to my website, evergreensoulcare.com.
Evergreensoulcare.com. Got it.
Yes. My contact info is on there. I'd be happy to connect with people about their stories.
Reid, thanks so much. It's been fun to be with you today.
Thank you. You too, Adam.